This meeting is being recorded.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to January 29th edition of the Gateway API Sync. As always, this meeting is governed by the Kubernetes Code of Conduct, boiling down to be nice to one another, so please do be nice to one another. We have an open agenda, and only a few items on there that are all mine currently. So if you have anything that you want to bring in, please put it on the meeting notes on the agenda. We'll be happy to get to that if we can get to that today. And if you have an idea for something you want to talk about, we can't get to it today, we can get it on next week's meeting agenda. Yeah, so with that, we'll just kind of start getting into it. But if at any point you have questions or comments or basically want to pipe up, please do use the raise hand feature in Zoom, as that helps us to organize and kind of keep things coordinated. Okay, I'll share my screen here. And hopefully everybody can see the meeting notes. I'll make it a little bigger too. So yeah, I just wanted to start us off by saying congrats to everybody who was able to get a proposal through the incredible, like, I think it's like 1% acceptance rate or something. We had 4 things that were like Gateway API related: session persistence with Gina Ye and Grant Spence, service mesh with Mike and Flynn, gRPC route, Richard and Arca were doing that one, and then the maintainer track, which we dedicated to Gateway API this round. All about Gateway API. There's probably some more stuff that's relevant. I saw definitely some people who are in Gateway API talking about relevant things, like there was like sidecar service mesh with Mike Beaumont and I forgot the person's name from Buoyant, and there's a few other things. So looks like there's going to be a pretty good Gateway API representation at Paris once again. So there's a link to the schedule there if you're interested in looking at what's there, and we'd love to see you there. And that just leads into my second thing, which is the Contributor Summit, which for many of us, I think, for me personally, I think is kind of the most important part of going to KubeCon, is still open. The CFPs are still open for that until the 4th. Please do, if you have any proposals, any ideas for talks you'd like to do at the Contributor Summit, which takes place just before KubeCon, do put those in. You got a couple more days. This Sunday is when those close. We'd love to have as many of those as possible. And with that, on KubeCon related things, well, technically, V1.1 is kind of the release we expect to have out in time for KubeCon. And we've been reviewing this doc together on these calls for the last few weeks, with the top 4 things being the things we expect to be kind of the story behind V1.1: route port matching, gRPC route conformance profiles, and direct policy attachment. I think the only thing that's really changed much, we can talk about all of them briefly, but route port matching doesn't have an official owner right this second. So it's had work done on it. But if you are interested in grabbing something that will go out in this next release, this could definitely use assistance. I think John, right? John, yeah. Sorry, John Howard is the person to. I was looking at him. I just was trying to figure out who did this one before. Might be the go-to person for like touching base. If you want to pick this up, he should be able to give you quite a bit of information and like kind of get you started on that. And then obviously we, the maintainers, and just the general chat room should be able to help you if this is something you want to pick up. So yeah, that one kind of needs somebody to carry it forward a little bit further. Otherwise it might not. I don't know. It's probably going to make it into V1.1, but it'll definitely be more sure if somebody grabs it and says, yep, I want this to get into V1.1. What we need for graduation right now to get it over the finish line is documentation, some conformance tests, and ideally one more implementation. gRPC route is doing good. Richard's been the owner of that so far. Go ahead.
Oh yeah. So before we hit gRPC route, did anyone want to say anything about route port matching? No. Okay, cool. Sorry. Go ahead, Richard.
Hey, Richard here. I know I've been gone for a while. I've been heads down mostly for the past few months working on a Gamma implementation and a session persistence implementation, but I'm back. I revived the gRPC route conformance test implementation PR and pushed that yesterday. Hopefully we're in good shape. I think most of the gap is covered by that scope. So yeah, looking forward to getting this to V1.1.
Very cool.
Yeah, thank you for adding me on that chain. I will poke some of our folks. The Cilium has some support for gRPC route as well, so we should be able to check if Cilium passes the conformance test.
Awesome. Oh yeah, I should add, I've been testing this with Envoy Gateway and it passes it with flying colors. And I imagine there are other implementations that are already conformant according to this test.
Yeah, I think at
Yeah,
Kong,
well, that's
we'll
what
be
we
able to
want for the
validate.
basic round of conformance test for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think we'll be able to validate some of the tests for you too over here. So very cool. Thank you for continuing pushing forward on that. Seems like we're tracking good. And you two have the talk, which is awesome. I'm glad you got that in.
Yeah.
Conformance profiles. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I was just going to say Gina's here with me as well. She's another speaker on Gateway API.
Awesome.
Hey, this is Gina. I'll be talking about the talk of the session persistence with Grant. I was on the call.
Roger that. Cool. Very cool. Awesome. Yeah, I'm glad we got that one in too, because obviously we want to, that one's kind of at least at the last KubeCon, it was like everybody was asking us, when do you get session persistence? So it's like, that one's definitely been a hot ticket item. Very cool.
100%.
Conformance profiles. So actually, Mattia and I have been kind of co-working on this one for a little while. And we had a meeting, just him and I, last week, where we kind of like rounded up and like looked at what we needed. So technically, the PR says that it has a probationary period that goes until February. We're very close to being able to say kind of that it's stable. So there's a PR update right now that I put in that takes care of a couple of the graduation criteria that are resolved and actually adds 2 new ones that we wanted to make sure we were represented when we talked last week, him and I. I probably should, I think actually it's right here somewhere, but basically, here it is. So basically, this is a small change to say we're okay. We have not really had any significant issues with storing in Git for now. If we need to change that in the future, that is not an immovable thing that we can't do. So for the purposes of graduation criteria, we are trying to assert that that is done. We don't need to worry about that for going stable with the initial kind of effort. And then we gathered feedback from SIG Arch, and there wasn't much of any, negative or positive. And in that time, while we've been talking with them, we also got the network policy group has started picking up and using our exact conformance profiles test suite, and is basically using that over for NetPol. In fact, Surya Seetherman from the network policy group is joining us on our maintainer track at this coming KubeCon to discuss how that's gone and basically do kind of an outreach for people to see if there's other groups that might be interested in taking on our conformance test suite. So that's been going well. 2 things that we need to do that we talked about were finalizing the reporting structure. So there were some updates to the GEP in recent weeks for basically just kind of tweaking how things look in a report. Those need to be enacted. And then for V1.1, we'll have to like just update the existing reports. And then ultimately, and this is kind of the big, we don't go out the door without some kind of documentation, because everybody who's who's implemented the reporting thing so far has kind of just figured it out. But we'll have some kind of documentation before we say this is stable, because that would be kind of ridiculous to not have some kind of documentation but say it's stable. So not a whole lot left to do, but we are saying, I think I put it in here, maybe I forgot to. Yeah, so, well, we have to basically say for the probationary period, extend it to basically after KubeCon, and we expect that we should be able to have this done well before KubeCon. So that's how that's going with the cleanup and just kind of getting the last little bits done there. It's not, we haven't been thinking of it, if somebody disagrees with this, please do speak up, but we haven't been thinking of this as a blocker for GA, but there is a display. There is an issue running around for like making the display nicer than the current like implementations.md page with a badge situation. There is somebody working on that issue right now, but basically figuring out what can we do to make that look better, or just kind of make it more interactive or something like that. If you're interested in that kind of thing, please reach out to us. We have an open issue with somebody who is leading the charge on that, and could potentially kind of get you involved in that project if you're interested in something more front end kind of user experience kind of thing, or want to do something on the UI. And then last but not least, direct policy attachment, which I'll let Nick go ahead and talk about where that one's at.
Yeah, so I'm still working on this. It's one of those things where I initially thought, oh, I'll just be able to lift a bunch of stuff out of GEP 7.13 and put it into its own thing, but the process of doing it has sort of made it clear that no, I got to rewrite big sections to make everything make sense. So I am working on doing that. It's one of those things where I have not been specific enough before with policy attachment, and it has burned us. So I'm trying to be pretty specific, but that means I've got to write this pretty carefully. So it's taking longer than I would have hoped. Still going, but yeah, I'm still hoping to have it done. It should definitely be done before 1.1, but yeah, I'm sorry that it hasn't happened for sooner. That's all.
No need to be sorry. Thanks for the update, though. Cool. Let's see, where did I put on next? Jack added something.
Yep, I think with the 1.1 release scope, though, I think one of the other things that's interesting to talk about is if you scroll down further in that doc, Shane, there's also, if we can get some of these things out of experimental, then that means that there is some spot to have things come into experimental. So obviously, session persistence is the clear candidate for moving to experimental, because we've got not only folks actively working on it, but most of the sort of moving into experimental criteria are basically hit. But there are a few other ones here that are pretty close. And so sort of, again, it really kind of sucks that we have to manage our bandwidth by saying nothing's going in until some stuff comes out. But if you really want to get your stuff in, helping us get things out is a great way to do that. So helping us with reviews of any PRs for the stuff that we just talked about, those 4 things that we just talked about, to get them out, or helping with further work to get those things out, that will be very helpful. And sort of that will help us then have space to bring in some other ones into experimental.
Roger that. So this is kind of what we're tracking for release scope for the next couple of releases. And like Nick said, we have kind of a pipeline issue where we have really big sections of like experimental right now, and we just have a lot of things in flight. If you have any questions about this, now would be a good time. If you have any concerns or questions about like kind of how things are looking, what the releases are looking like going forward. Otherwise, we'll move on to the rest of the agenda. Go ahead, David.
So some of the incoming GEPs, it looks like they're not written. Like, is anyone writing them? And then if no one steps up,
no one has picked them up yet. So yeah, but I mean, I think rate limiting, there's already a couple of implementations doing some stuff, but nobody really knows about how portable it is. I think that one I would love to see someone do the first work. So the first work for rate limiting, for retries, for auth, and for cause is to go around all the implementations, see who is doing that config already and how they do it, and sort of do a review like I did for timeouts, and sort of start the GEP as a very provisional GEP with just a background section that sort of explains this is the current state of play. That gets us all on the same page and gets the conversation started. But I think that's the sort of the heavy lift is one of the reasons of why some of these things aren't done, is that someone needs to actually go and do the comparison work.
Yeah, I guess I'm wondering, if no one does that, then
the feature will sit there not being done until someone gets around to doing it. I mean,
that's
how it works.
This is more like a wish list, and you're signaling what you want help with, and then
yes, exactly. Yeah, it's not like, this is not like definite things that are definitely happening. This is things that we know that people have asked us about, and asked us about a lot. So bigger features or more in-demand features. This is why Rob has this interest level thing. Like, there's a lot of interest in auth, for example, but no one has as yet put their name down to be the one who sort of starts the process of getting the conversation going here to bring this, to sort of get this started a bit more. And that's the next step. So yeah, if you're interested in auth, you want it to happen, then this is the that's the way to do it, is to sort of signal that you're interested in doing this sort of background review, so that then we can get a more wide-ranging conversation happening.
Yep. As always, it's a volunteer project. So the people who have the strongest need, please step forward, please be champions, and we, the community, will support you. All right. So the only other item we have right now is Jack wants to talk about strong validation enforcement. Again, we have time, so if anybody wants to add anything, please do add it underneath here, but go ahead, Jack.
Yeah, thanks for giving me a couple minutes here. So I'm a bit more of a lurker, so I apologize for kind of the simplicity of this question, but
No apology needed.
for existing features that have been implemented, and in the case of this one, it's around adding support for HTTP redirects. I noticed that only a subset of the response codes were added. I was curious how the community thinks about, so like what extent validations should be added. Are only the first two added because, like, as a community, those are kind of the two items that we want to standardize on? Or is there a larger theme on adopting and aligning to RFC standard? I'm just kind of curious how that's thought about more broadly. And then secondly, for scenarios like this, do you consider that a bug, or do you consider it an enhancement to add upon that existing functionality?
Can I go, Shane?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, okay, I'll try and answer those roughly in order. So in general, we try to have the rule that we don't have fields without some validation. We've tended to err on the side of having the validation be more strict rather than less strict, because you can always make it more strict, but making it, and having some validation is better than nothing. Making it less strict is easier than making it more strict. Sure. After the fact, and so we've tended to err on the side of being reasonably restrictive. In this specific case, I 100% agree. I think most of the design of this has been driven by what people see and want, rather than what the RFC says. I agree that there's no reason for us not to just expand this enum and let people use any of the valid redirects. In general, the distinction between a bug and a feature is a bit fuzzy because this is an API rather than a product. We're not going to block something because it's a feature rather than a bug, like for a release. So in this case, it's a bit nebulous as to whether it's a bug or a feature, but I think regardless, we should fix it. So yeah, maybe I'd shade more towards a bug personally, but I certainly I will reply on this issue afterwards to say, yes, I think we should do that. A small PR to add this isn't, I don't think will be no problem. And yeah, so I think that in general, we sort of use the word feature to reflect bigger things rather than small things like this. Although I'm sure we've all seen in the past that not just here, that sometimes making a small change to a field can actually be a big change if it implies a larger behavior change. So yeah, it's kind of it depends as to how big changes are, but yeah, in general, yes, we always try to have validation. We try to err on the side of being more strict with the validation rather than less, and expanding it as needed. And for the record, we're pretty much always interested in discussing at least loosening the validations. So if you have a reason to want to loosen the validations, then we're always willing to talk about it. I think the one where people have been more interested in the past about loosening validations is about list sizes, in particular, like routes, numbers of routes and things like that. A lot of those ones about numbers of items, we have to be really careful about, because there's a multiplicative size problem, where if you have a list that has lists that have lists, then you've got to be really careful about how big each one of those things can be, because you can, if all of them get filled to maximum, you can end up with really big records that might not fit into a single etcd record, which can produce very weird behavior. So that's one of the reasons why we have length restrictions on many fields. Does that make sense, Jack?
Got it. Yeah, definitely. And I was curious, do you prefer to bubble it up in this type of meeting or in Slack channel or as an issue, or even go one step further and like present it as a pull request with the change? Is there a preferred
Kind of depends on the
process?
situation.
Yeah,
But
yeah, yeah. And it's the most common, but at the same time least useful answer of it depends. Yeah. Look, I think for
what you did is
smaller
fine.
things like this. Sorry, you go, Shane.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was just saying, what putting in an issue for this was fine. There's no
Yeah.
problem.
Yeah, I think discussing it in Slack and saying, "Do you think this is a real problem?" That then leads to an issue, that then leads to a pull request, feels like about the ideal set of things. For smaller things like this, I mean, this is going to be a one-line change. Personally, I think it's fine to go straight to pull request. But if you're going to if you're starting to introduce behavior changes or your pull request is bigger, then it's probably better to talk about whether or not the pull request is something we want before you start on making the pull request, because otherwise you might spend a few days working on a pull request that we say no. Yeah, so we got two questions. Candice, you go first.
Yeah, I just wanted to make a comment that Jack has a point in a way, because this is a validation for just a status code. So I mean, this isn't something that an end user would configure. You know, here's, I want to configure, this is my status code that I start with or something. It's an enum on a.
It's enum when you're requesting a redirect. So it actually is something that will be configured by a user, because this is when you're saying, you're putting a filter on the request that says, please redirect requests that match this using this code. So it defaults to 302.
I see what you mean. Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Now I get it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And so like it makes sense. It makes sense that maybe people might want to use a different redirect code. I guess when we initially thought about this, the 301 and 302 seemed like the most common ones, and that's why we picked them. But looking at the RFC briefly, it does make sense that maybe people might want to use them, and I don't think it's going to hurt. However, as always, I guess adding the enum to the field here, it does mean that as I think Michael noted in the chat, that means that then if it's core feature, that means that all of those things must be supported by all the implementations. And so technically we really should have a conformance test or something that tests that, you can request all of those things and get the correct redirect type. So this is a good example of one where my initial thing was like, oh, sure, we can add it. And then hey, but the support levels mean that it's a bit more complicated than just adding it, because now we've got to think about what does that mean for existing implementations who maybe have, added, expect an enum, and, maybe don't support, 304 or 307 or something. So yeah, we'll need to have something in the PR for this about, we already have something saying like what you do if you do that, but we need to sort of say how supported are these things. We do have the experimental channel, so the validation can be different in the experimental channel versus a standard channel for the CRDs. So conceivably we can add this to the experimental channel and have implementations test to see if it works. Yeah, so there is a sort of a slightly larger concern there. Thanks for the question, Jack. It's really cool.
Yeah.
Thank you.
To your question, I mean, creating an issue and then bringing it right up in the sync was perfect for obvious reasons. Like you wrote down the issue and we can have an asynchronous discussion, but you brought it up synchronously, and then we're like, yeah, here's the backstory, and also we'll need some conformance testing around it. So perfect. We also use discussion sometimes too for just questions, but there's really no wrong way to do it. It just kind of depends. Because we're making a change, I am kind of curious if you can share your use case, the background for why you need the change. Do you have an implementation that you're working on? What's the situation on your side?
For redirects?
Yeah, I'm just kind of curious, like what led you here?
Sure. So I'm from the Microsoft side, and our existing product functionality supports this today in Ingress API, and to bring feature parity across, we'd want to expand the available response codes that customers could configure. So in general, 304 and 305 is pretty rare, but we do see a couple 307s every once in a while.
Cool. So are you transitioning to Gateway API then? Is that the idea?
Yeah, we've already started our implementation of Gateway API for our project.
Gotcha. Are you guys listed on the implementations page?
Yep, we are.
Which one is it?
We're App Gateway for Containers.
Oh, okay. Okay, cool. Yeah, all right. App Gateway. I know what you're talking about. Yeah, this one, right? Yeah, okay. Now I know. Now I have a frame of reference. Okay, cool. Very cool.
Yeah, feel
All
free
right.
to ping me as well if you want to chat further too.
Yeah, sounds good. And then I subscribe to this one, and it sounds like Nick's going to come in and basically say, "Yep." Plus, let's figure out how we're going to test it, and then we can move forward with that one. Seems like everything Nick said is what I would say. Like he captured my sentiments entirely. Sounds like a fine change. All right. We got a couple more items popping up and plenty of time left.
Yep. I would say for the session persistence discussion, because we've had substantial discussions on that in the past, I think that Arco's one may be a bit quicker, and so we can if we do that first, then we can leave the rest of the time to discuss session persistence stuff. Is that okay?
Is that right? Arco, is this a pretty short one?
Yeah, should be short.
Okay.
Let's hit that one next.
Terribly opposed. Let's just do that quickly then, because I agree the session persistence one might take a little bit.
Okay, I'll just bring this up. So this is about, this relates to the backend TLS policy. And if you look at the API for backend TLS policy, it allows the user to specify a CA certs field. And that allows the implementation, the load balancer of the gateway to validate the peer. I'm just curious, I don't see any fields for the proxy certs, which is the proxy's key and the cert, so that the peer, the backend in this case, can validate the proxy. Maybe I missed this, but are we supposed to be using the listener certs as the proxy certs for this case?
I have some thoughts here, but Candace, did you want to say anything before I dive in?
No, go right ahead.
Okay. So yeah, I think when we've talked about this one in the past, the thing that I sort of thought about it was that it should be that I didn't think that it didn't seem right to me that you would end up with a certificate and private key for the proxy per backend TLS policy. Generally, the certificates and private keys should be being assigned to a gateway implementation sort of out of band of this config. And because of that, that's why we left it out of backend TLS policy. My anticipation was that that if you need to do this, that there needs to be sort of an out of band way for the proxy to have a certificate and private key somewhere that is also signed by the CAs that are going to be used by the backend TLS policy, and that's configured by some other method. I don't mind talking about that sort of probably on the issue, but that was sort of the initial thing, and that's why it's not there. Is that it was anticipated that config would be provided to the implementation out of band.
Makes sense. I think that's good. Okay, so I just want to make sure that I didn't miss anything. Okay, that makes sense. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, cool.
All right, Costin, let's talk about session versus permanent cookies.
Yeah, I also opened a bug. We have a customer that is using Istio persistent sessions, and we found some bugs in FB. And I was looking at the specifications that we have today, and it's a bit confusing about the two kinds of cookies. For background, Mozilla, I mean, the official documentation defines session cookie as a cookie that expires when you close a tab or you close a browsing session and doesn't have expiry or max age. And a persistent session is one that has max age and it lasts until it expires. And the main reason for one versus the other is the GDPR, where one is treated differently. One needs consent, the other one doesn't. And I'm trying to figure out what would be the proper way, or what other people who are implementing the Gateway API believe about this, because the main use case for persistent session obviously is to stick to a particular endpoint, and setting a 2-week permanent session doesn't really make a lot of sense, since very few backends will last for 2 weeks. While the session cookies are probably far more frequent and far more useful. But there is no, I mean, again, the problem is that there is no distinction. There is no way in the API to specify I want a session cookie versus a persistent. Does it make sense? Do I confuse you, or?
I have to think about it because I'm trying to think like what I'm trying to
I
think
think
about how
the distinction makes sense to me between a session and a persistent cookie, you know, in the sense that, yeah, okay, like it makes sense that a session cookie only lasts as long as the tab, and that persistent cookie has some expiry time. I guess I'd probably want to sort of hand over to Grant and or Gina about what the folks who have been working on session persistence think that is it. I mean, I guess the first question I would ask is this a let's deal with this in the future kind of problem at the moment? And if that's the case, then it feels like Costin, you're saying you want to deal with it now. Yeah. So yeah, Grant.
Yeah, I haven't thought about specifically this issue yet. I think we had a similar question that was how much detail should we expose in the session persistence API? And Costin, I assume you're talking about the session persistence SCEP that we're working on, right?
Yeah. And the max age, and we have two fields in the right there right now. I mean, the one I've seen for controlling the age, but in an example where expiry is set. So we need to make a choice. I mean, we remove references to expiry and then we focus on session cookies, or we need to add an extra Boolean indicating which one it is, because it's very confusing. For Istio, we're going to implement for sure, because we have customers that need session cookies. GDPR is important.
I mean, is it more that, isn't it that the presence of an expiry or a max age or whatever you call it, that is the thing that distinguishes between a persistent cookie and a session cookie?
Yeah, but you can have session cookies that expire. So the fields that we have there, first of all, default value is 0, but it's a bit. You should look a bit at the details and try to work example.
Okay.
Which details?
Oh, I filed a bug with the actual, the references to the, how to distinguish between them and then.
Oh, gotcha. You did file one?
Yeah.
Could you link that here?
Okay.
I'd like to take a look.
Yeah, I just filed it today because we just found the envoy bug today.
Sure. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So if you could drop that that link into the meeting notes here under the you said, that would be amazing. Thank you.
So tell me if my grasp of the situation is right. Right now, we just have expiry, which in theory could indicate whether you were permanent or not. And the question is, should we just have like a Boolean? Did I get that right?
Yes, that's one option. What a Boolean,
Okay.
because expire even for a session, I mean, close until you close the browser, you can still say or an hour. So if you keep the browser longer than a day or an hour, we still want the session to expire and to force you to log in or do something. Or we can use value 0 to mean it's a session cookie, and that's fine as well.
Roger that. Okay, gotcha.
Yep.
Yeah, I don't know that I can understand how Istio is probably running into that. Grant, do you have, it sounds like you haven't done much thinking in this space, but I guess the best thing right now would be link the ongoing conversation, Costin, but then is this probably something just worth putting in the current GEP as something we want to probably try to figure out what we want to do about before provisional, especially since we have an implementation that's in need of it.
Yeah, it seems like one of those things that if it's easy enough to solve it right now, we should just solve it right now. If not, we should definitely document it in the GEP either way. So I want to do some more reading on this, and I'll put something in the GEP my next PR update regarding this, and I can follow up with Costin offline as well.
Cool.
Perfect. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Costin.
Yeah, thanks for bringing it up. All right, cool. We have covered everything on our agenda, and actually we have quite a bit of time left. If we'll give a couple seconds here. If anybody has any last minute things they want to bring up, please do raise your hand. We can take a couple more minutes. Otherwise, we'll give everybody 15-ish minutes of their time back. Go ahead, Quang.
Hi, Shane. Thanks. So we have an implementation of Gateway API in our product that we are trying to go to market with. We have, of course, our own custom resource definitions, right, for our APIs. But we have more protocols that are not in Gateway API. I was just curious, what is a general practice or less frowned upon way of adding like a Gateway API like for
like your own routes?
Yeah, your own routes. Yeah, like
we have one implementation that is doing stun, and the way that they've done that, I think it's just called Stunner, and the way that implementation has kind of dealt with protocols of which we don't have routes for is to, in that case, it's a layered protocol, so it's on top of UDP. They just use UDP routes and then put their own decorators on top of it. I wouldn't say that's necessarily, like, for lack of a better word, like the blessed way or whatever, but it is kind of a way that we've seen. We don't really, I don't think have any documented, like, here's how you should do this kind of way of doing other protocols right now.
Yeah, I guess there's definitely again, for the record, for the recording, it is definitely intended that you can, as an implementation, you can experiment with your own route types and protocols and stuff like that. That's fine. That's what implementation specific support level is for you to be able to experiment with that sort of stuff. I guess all that we ask is, if you've done something there that's cool, then consider bringing it and talking about putting in an agenda item on the meeting and walking us through, like, how your route works, what it's doing, what why you've got a separate route, what sort of protocols you're talking about, with the intent being, so one of the reasons we have these varying levels, like core, extended, and implementation specific, is that it's kind of intended that and expected that over time there'll be stuff that some people do in implementation specific that more than one implementation is interested in doing. And so in that case, that's exactly the sort of case where we can do the thing that I was talking about before and do a review of what everyone is doing in their implementation specific thing and see if we can extract commonalities or even just use that thing if everyone supports it to then turn that into an extended thing. And so the difference between implementation specific and extended is, in both cases, another implementation doesn't have to do it, but in the extended case, there is a defined behavior to how that works that is backed up with conformance tests. So, if other people wanted to implement, stun UDP routes, then that would be a thing where we could be like, okay, let's talk about, what Stunner is doing differently or what the other implementation wants to do or is doing, try and extract some commonality and turn that into an extended, like, stun route type, for lack of a better example. So yeah, so like it's 100% fine to for implementations and again, expected for you to have your own CIDs that are referenced, that attach themselves to a gateway in the same way that a HTTP route or any of the other sort of included in the API routes work.
Mhm.
And yeah, I'd love to hear about them. And if we find that other implementations are interested in doing the same thing, then that's totally a thing that we can talk about, bringing towards extended in the same way that gRPC route is currently in extended.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I just kind of wonder, like, there's like HTTP route or TCP route, UDP route, and then suddenly there's like these really different CRDs, right, that we have. I'm just kind of curious, how do people approach that? Or
Best practice would probably just start with like, studying through what's in HTTP route, for instance, and trying to model after that to some degree if it's possible.
right,
What protocol are you talking about?
like SCTP
Oh,
or diameter, or those are like some very telco specific
yeah.
use cases. We'll definitely want to model it in a way that, use gateway and like a route and do that parent reference.
Yep.
Yeah. Like Nick said, try to make something that kind of looks like it could fit in with Gateway API in your CRDs, and then the next best step, and do it as soon as you can, is try to see if there's anybody else in the community that also needs it. Because as soon as you have that, that's something we'd be willing to look at as an upstream API potentially.
Yeah,
Okay.
and 100%. And also, I think everyone should feel like confident to bring. If you have something you want to show us, that's 100% fine. That's a completely valid agenda item for this meeting, is to say, hey, our implementation is doing a policy to do this, or our implementation is doing a custom route or a custom filter or something like that. I would love to see more implementations bringing the cool stuff that they're doing using the building blocks that Gateway API provides, so that you can make people more aware of what's going on. I mean, I know that both Envoy Gateway and Quadrant are doing awesome work with policy attachment. I haven't had a chance to go and sit down and play with it yet, but if someone from there wanted to come and give like a 10 or 15 minute overview of what's happening there, then I think that would be really valuable for everybody. And the same goes for you. Like, if you've got if you've started work on an SCTP route and you'd like to talk about it, then bring it here and show us. And that would be the place where that would mean that we could say, like, oh, have you thought about this problem that we encountered when we were building a HTTP route or something like that, that might not be obvious from what's there. But that's how open source works, and that's how discussions should work. And so I certainly would love to see more of that.
Yeah, we love demos, and that's exactly what happened with Stunner, and how we became aware of it is, I want to say his name might have been Gerard, came in and demoed it for us. Now, unfortunately, in that case, there wasn't another implementation out there with the same use case, but I would expect SCTP probably has a bigger reach. So definitely would love to see a demo.
So like, if there's not a lot of implementation out there, like you said, it's a still good form to just keep it in that particular implementation.
Yeah, totally.
Okay.
I mean, part of what we're trying to do with Go API here is to make it so that that there's a shape of the API, and then you can do your own thing that sort of fits the general shape. And then it's more likely then that if we something does end up becoming standardized in the future, if it's fitting into the general shape, it's easier to take what a lot different people have done, even if it's a bit different, and make something common out of it that then becomes part of the API, right? Like,
right.
I mean, I think there's a lot of discussions we need to have about what belongs in the API and a few other things like that, but don't let that stop you. Like, do whatever. The whole idea here is that you can pass the conformance test for the features that we include conformance tests for, and be a conformant gateway API implementation. What you do on top of that, that's 100% your business, right? Like, the gateway API is not here to be like, you can't do that,
Right.
except insofar as behaviors that are covered by the conformance tests. But like, if you do stuff that's not covered by conformance tests or by existing features, then it's kind of do whatever you like.
But it still looks and feels like Gateway API, and that's okay.
Yeah, with the caveat that the more you make it look and feel like Gateway API, the more likely it is that if someone else wants to do the same thing, that your work won't sort of end up being substantially rewritten, right? Like, if that ends up becoming a standard, you want to be able to use a lot of what you've done already without having to like rewrite the whole thing from the ground up. That's more of a practical thing rather than a practical guideline rather than a you must do this kind of guideline. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's great. Thanks.
Yeah, and stay in touch with the community because, like, for instance, just because last year only one implementation wanted to do stun doesn't mean it'll always be that way. So stay
Yeah.
connected, stay in touch with the community because you wouldn't want to be in a situation where you're like, all right, well, nobody needs this, and then you don't come back for the community for a while. You come back and then all of a sudden we have an SCTP route or something like that. I mean, obviously we would reach out to you too, but
Yeah.
things change a lot over time. So very cool.
Awesome. Thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah, awesome.
Any more last minutes, or should we adjourn? Go ahead, Grant.
Yeah, I just had a quick question. I was reading through the policy attachment GEP, and I noticed the section on the conformance level for policy attachment. I'll put it in the chat just so everyone. So it says the policy attachment pattern is associated with the extended conformance level. Does that mean any?
That's it's old. So like
Okay.
it kind of predates the idea that extended means you have conformance tests. The intent here is that, and it's complicated because policy attachment is a pattern, not an API. The intent here is that if you've got a policy, it should behave the same way. You know, like you should aim to abide by what we've written down in this GEP or in the GEPs when they get split. But it can't, this is one of the things that I'm going to update because it's not really extended because it doesn't have conformance tests. So yeah, it's a bit complicated, I guess is the, sorry to not be able to give you a better answer.
Yeah, I guess, is it referring to the entire policy attachment pattern or is it?
Yes.
So what does it mean specifically for, like session persistence policy? Can that be anything more than extended? Could that ever be a core
so
conformance?
Conceivably it could be. I mean, right now policy attachment is still a pretty experimental pattern because we don't have good examples. We don't the work to sort of make this a real implementable thing that doesn't have significant sort of concerns about it is not done. So like right now we've got pretty significant, people have raised pretty significant core concerns about how users understand whether or not a policy is affecting their object. For direct policy attachment, and this is going to be one of the things that's included in the split, it's more straightforward as long as we keep in mind that direct policy attachment is intended to be used when you have a policy that attaches to a thing and only affects that thing. So, if you have a direct policy attachment, a TLS backend policy, for example, that attaches to a service and it only affects that service. So in order to know which TLS backend policies are getting the service, you need to know that TLS backend policy is supported by the implementation, and you need to get all the services and get all the TLS backend policies and connect them up, because there's no way we can't put anything in the service to tell users that their policy is being affected. Although there are some suggestions that maybe we might be able to do, and so that's the sort of thing where policies can't become core until we have solutions to those problems. Direct attach policies anyway. And that's one of the reasons why we're splitting direct attach policy from inherited policy, because inherited policy sort of multiplies that problem by a couple of orders of magnitude. Now, for something like session persistence, where I feel like it's probably going to be applying at a route level, or a backend level. I think you've talked about that, and so that is more complicated because if you've got the same object that it can apply at different levels, it's kind of an inherited policy, even if it's not actually inherited in some ways. And so it has all the problems of how do you understand whether or not something is a session persistence policy is attached to your thing or not. So in terms of support, like do I personally want to see policies be included in the core at some point in the probably distant future? Yeah, I'd love to see that. Do I think that it will happen soon? Probably not, because I think that for a while there's going to be implementations that can't do one type of policy or another, and so things will probably sit in extended for some time. But again, the intent is that for something like session persistence to graduate to GA itself, it would need to at least be a solid feature in extended support, in that it's optional, is something can be GA but still optional, right? So something can be GA but extended, and so we want to see GEPs move toward GA, but that does not mean being GA does not mean that things need to be core. Like, not every implementation needs to support something for that support to be GA. Is that answering the question you are asking? I'm sorry, I rambled a bit.
Yeah, I think it helps provide the context. So your hope is that it would potentially be core in the future. And I guess my realization is that, can things sort of go from extended to core through the evolution of, I guess, being experimental, or whatever comes before GA?
Yes. Like, I wouldn't. Again, all of this is sort of very pie in the sky because we've never had this happen before. So like, whatever things are the first things to do this is going to be things that kind of end up defining the policy as we do it. But in terms of, I wouldn't stress too much about things being core. So I think that I would expect that that things will sit in extended for some time, if not for sort of the foreseeable future, because now with the conformance profiles, we have a way for things to be in extended, but for you to be able to see. And once we have the supported features on gateway class, then implementations will be able to indicate whether or not they support an extended feature on the gateway class. So as a user, you can install an implementation, then look at the gateway class and be like, does this thing really support session persistence? Yes, it does. Look, there's a thing on the gateway class, and that gateway class thing will be the thing that the conformance tests use to validate that the thing is doing, like, your implementations will be able to claim support for things that then the conformance test will check, and the conformance reports will validate that the feature is sort of supported, even if it's extended, even if it's not core. So I understand sort of the desire to sort of want to move towards everybody supports this, and practically over time, I would expect that to happen for some things, which session persistence and, to be honest, TLS backend policy feel like likely things that might end up moving into core at some point. But we sort of can't guarantee anything about that because we haven't done it before. Does that make more sense? Yeah.
Yeah, it's helpful. I think what you're saying is just start with extended and worry about it later.
Yeah, it's future us's problem, right?
Cool.
I think it's fair to say that we want to seek out all the features that can be core.
Yes.
But for any given feature, we don't necessarily want it to make a goal to push it to core. That's not necessarily the way to look at it.
Yeah.
Although I get that there's a lot of desire from implementations to take anything that they can do API wise and then get that into the API so that it's maintained there, so that there's a feeling of security in its future and that you're not going to end up with something wildly different from everybody else and that kind of thing. Extended covers that just fine, right? Like, once it's in extended, it gets that characteristic. It's maintained upstream. So yeah, don't worry too much about pushing things into core. Good thoughts though. Cool.
Yeah. Is that everything you need to talk about there, Grant? Hopefully that has been helpful.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, thanks.
Awesome.
We are now out of time. Thank you, everybody, for all the topics today. If you have any topics that you just popped up, please do put them on the meeting list or the meeting notes for the next week's agenda, and we will see you then. Cheers,
Thanks
everybody.
very much. Cool. Thanks, everyone.